The lawyer's office was quiet except for the sound of papers shuffling. I was sitting across from my parents, William and Catherine, waiting to hear about my grandmother's will. They had called me home for this. I thought it would be straightforward. I thought I was just here as a formality. Then Catherine's eyes shifted toward William, and he cleared his throat in that way he always did when he was about to say something difficult. I had learned to recognize that sound in 23 years of family dinners. But nothing prepared me for what came next. "There's something we need to tell you," William said, his hands folded on the mahogany table. "Before we go through your grandmother's wishes, something about you." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean, something about me?" Catherine reached for my hand, and I pulled it back. That's when I knew it was bad. She only reached for my hand when she was about to hurt me. "You're not adopted," William said. The words hung in the air like a smell. "You never were. We should have told you the truth a long time ago. We were wrong not to." The room tilted. Not adopted. The one thing I had always known about myself, the story I told when people asked where I came from, was a lie. I was sitting in a lawyer's office with my parents and a man in a gray suit, and my entire identity was collapsing like a building with a faulty foundation. "My name is Alina, and I'm 23 years old. 3 hours ago, I learned that everything I believed about my origins was constructed from lies. I grew up knowing I was adopted. It was never a secret. My parents had told me the story when I was 5 years old, sitting in our living room in Seattle with photo albums spread across the coffee table. They explained adoption with the kind of gentle honesty that made it feel like a choice they'd made for love, like they had selected me specifically from all the children in the world. I had never questioned it. I had built my identity on it. But sitting in that lawyer's office, I realized I had built my identity on quicksand. The lawyer, a man named Harrison with reading glasses and kind eyes, kept glancing between my parents and me. He looked uncomfortable, like he was witnessing something he shouldn't be allowed to see. William continued talking, his voice steady but distant, the way it got when he was delivering information rather than having a conversation. "You're the biological child of Catherine and an anonymous sperm donor," he said. "We used surrogacy to have you. A woman carried you, and when you were born, we took you home. That was 23 years ago. The adoption story was something we created to make it simpler to explain to people. We didn't think we'd need to tell you the truth, but clearly we were wrong about that." I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt like it was being compressed from the inside. Not adopted. Biological child of Catherine. Surrogate. These words were describing me, but they didn't feel like they fit. Looking back at my childhood now, I can see the moments that didn't make sense. The way my father would sometimes look at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. The way relatives would comment on how interesting my features were, how I didn't look like anyone else in the family. My dark curly hair against their blonde and brown straightness. My olive skin that never tanned right. My height that seemed to come from nowhere, since both my parents were average height. I had asked about these things growing up, and they had given me vague answers about recessive genes or adoption mixing things up. I had accepted those answers because I didn't know there was another version of the truth. Devin, my older brother, had always looked like them. Blonde, blue-eyed with the kind of features that made people say he looked exactly like William or exactly like Catherine. I had never looked like anyone. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. But I was a kid, and kids don't interrogate the stories they're told. Kids believe their parents. The lawyer was explaining something about my grandmother's will now, but I wasn't listening. I was thinking about every conversation I'd ever had about my adoption. Every time I'd told someone I was adopted and felt that small pride in it, that sense of being chosen. Every time I'd wondered what my real family looked like, not understanding that I was already living with them. The term real family felt different now. It felt accusatory, like I had been using it wrong my entire life. I asked William and Catherine to take me home. The lawyer tried to continue the meeting, but I couldn't sit there anymore. In the car, nobody spoke. The radio played softly, a song I didn't recognize, and I focused on the lyrics instead of the silence in the car. I was trying to construct questions in my head, but every question led to another question, and none of them seemed to start in the right place. When we got home, I went straight to my room and closed the door. I sat on my bed, the same bed I'd had since I was 7 years old, surrounded by posters of musicians and books I'd collected over years. Everything in this room was proof of a life lived with these people. But suddenly, that life felt false. Catherine knocked on my door. I didn't answer. She knocked again, and then William's voice came through. "Elena, please, we need to talk about this." "I need to think," I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's body. I heard them walk away. Then I did something I had never done before. I Googled surrogacy secrets and fell down a rabbit hole of articles about children who had found out the truth about their origins through DNA tests, through conversations overheard, through documents discovered in attics. I read stories of people who felt betrayed, who felt erased, who wondered if their parents' love was real or just obligation. I read about the psychological impact of discovering you were not who you thought you were. By midnight, I had learned more about surrogacy than I ever wanted to know, and I still didn't understand why my parents had chosen to lie to me for my entire life. The next morning, I confronted them. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared hundreds of meals, and I demanded the full story. William and Catherine exchanged looks, and then they told me everything, piece by piece, like they were assembling a confession. Catherine couldn't conceive naturally. She had polycystic ovary syndrome, a condition that made it nearly impossible for her to produce viable eggs. When she was 32, she and William decided they wanted a biological child. They decided to use Catherine's eggs through IVF, but those eggs weren't viable either. So they made the decision to use an anonymous egg donor and William's sperm. They hired a surrogate, a woman named Melissa, to carry the pregnancy. Melissa was compensated. William said quietly, "She signed agreements. She had no legal claim to you. She was a surrogate, not a mother." The way he said it, like those two things were completely separate, made something inside me fracture further. Melissa had carried me in her body. She had grown me from nothing into a person. But to my parents, she was a service provider, a vessel, nothing more. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Catherine started crying. "We were afraid," she said. "We were afraid you'd feel less loved. We were afraid people would judge us. We were afraid you'd want to find your surrogate or your donor and abandon us. So you lied instead." My voice was harder than I intended. "You let me believe a false story about myself." "It wasn't false," William said. "You are adopted. Legally, we adopted you. We're your parents. That part was always true. But the adoption was what you told people because you didn't want them to know the real story," I said. "You told me a lie by commission. You constructed a false narrative and presented it as truth." The kitchen fell silent. I realized I was shaking. That night, I called my best friend Marcus and told him everything. He came over immediately, bringing chocolate and anger on my behalf. Marcus had known me since middle school. He knew my family. He had eaten countless dinners at our table. When I explained what had happened, he looked genuinely shocked. "They lied to you about your entire life," he said. "They said they were protecting me," I replied. "But I think they were protecting themselves." Marcus sat with me while I cried. I hadn't cried the day before, but now it was all coming out. The anger and confusion and betrayal. The feeling that I didn't know who I was anymore. The fear that maybe my parents didn't really love me, that I was just an obligation they'd taken on and then spent 23 years maintaining a lie about. "You need to know who the donors are," Marcus said. "You need to find them and talk to them. You need to understand where you really come from." I knew he was right, but I was terrified. What if I found them and they didn't want to know me? What if they had their own families and my existence was just a footnote in their histories? What if knowing them made me feel even more disconnected from William and Catherine? But I couldn't ignore the need. It was burning inside me like something alive and hungry. I needed answers that only strangers could give me. I found information about Melissa, the surrogate, in my parents' filing cabinet. I told them I was looking for it, and they didn't try to stop me. I found a contract with her name, address, and phone number. Melissa Chen lived in Portland, Oregon, only 3 hours away. The contract was signed 15 years ago. I had no idea if she still lived at that address or if she'd want to hear from me, but I had to try. I called her on a Tuesday evening. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the phone. When she answered, I said, "Hi, my name is Alina. I think you knew my parents, William and Catherine Torres, 23 years ago." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Melissa's voice came through, careful and quiet. "Oh my God, Alina." She remembered my name. She had carried me in her body, and even though she'd given me away, she had remembered my name for 23 years. I started crying immediately. "I need to meet you," I said. "I need to know who you are and what happened." Melissa agreed to meet me the following Saturday. She sounded nervous, but also like she had been waiting for this call her entire life. When I hung up, I sat in my room for an hour, not moving, just trying to process that I had a meeting scheduled with the woman who had created me. I didn't tell William and Catherine where I was going. I just left early on Saturday morning and drove to Portland. The drive felt both too short and impossibly long. My mind was racing through scenarios. What if Melissa rejected me? What if she wanted a relationship and I couldn't give her one? What if she was angry at my parents for adopting me and I became collateral damage in that anger? We met at a coffee shop in a quiet neighborhood. I got there early and ordered a coffee I didn't want, just so I would have something to hold in my shaking hands. Then Melissa walked in, and I recognized her immediately, not because we looked alike, but because something in her face felt familiar. She saw me at the same moment, and she froze. She was tall, with long, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had my eyes. She had my nose. She had my mouth. Seeing her was like looking at what I might become, a preview of my own future written in a stranger's face. "Alina," she said, approaching the table slowly. "Hi," I managed. She sat down across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Melissa started crying silently, tears rolling down her face without any sound. "I can't believe you're here," she whispered. "I can't believe I'm seeing you. You're so beautiful. You're so grown up." Melissa told me her story. She had been a medical student when she agreed to be a surrogate. She needed money for tuition, and surrogacy seemed like a way to help a family and help herself at the same time. She said the agency had been very clear about boundaries. No contact. A clean break. She understood going in that she would carry me and then hand me over, and she wouldn't see me again. "But that was harder than I thought it would be," she said. "When I was pregnant with you, you became real to me. I would feel you moving, and I would talk to you, and I would imagine what you would be like. And then when you were born, they let me hold you for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. And then they took you away." 5 minutes. That's all the time Melissa had been allowed to know me as a physical person rather than as an abstract concept. I was angry at my parents for that, even though I understood that they were following the rules that the agency had set. But those rules seemed cruel now. They seemed designed to erase Melissa from my story entirely. "I've thought about you every day," Melissa said. "Especially on your birthday. I always wondered if you were happy, if you were loved, if your parents took good care of you. I never regretted carrying you, but I regretted not being able to know how you turned out." I wanted to tell her that I was happy, that I had been loved, that my parents had taken care of me. But I couldn't say those things with the same certainty I would have had a week ago. Because now I knew they had been keeping a fundamental truth from me. Their love felt conditional on my not knowing the truth about myself. We spent 4 hours together that day. Melissa told me about her life. She had finished medical school and become a pediatrician. She had married a man named David, and they had 2 biological children. A daughter named Sophie, who was 19, and a son named Oliver, who was 16. She had never told them about me, she said, because she didn't know how to explain it. "Do they know now?" I asked. "I told them last night," Melissa said. "I told them I had a daughter I carried before I had them, and they were very surprised. But they want to meet you if you want to meet them." The idea of having a half-sister and a half-brother shocked me. My parents had always told me that Devin was my only sibling. But genetically, I had 2 other siblings. My life was bigger than I thought it was, and also smaller, more complicated, more fragmented. "I need time," I told Melissa, "to process all of this." "I understand," she said. "But please know that I'm here and I want to know you. I know I don't have any legal right to call you my daughter, but you came from me, and I would very much like to know who you've become." I gave her my phone number, and we hugged goodbye in the parking lot. It felt both familiar and completely foreign, like hugging a stranger who shared my face. Driving home, I felt hollowed out. Everything I thought I knew about myself was shifting. I had a biological mother who was a pediatrician in Portland. I had a biological father whose identity was kept secret by an agency. I had two half-siblings I had never met. And I had parents at home who had lied to me for 23 years about where I came from. When I got back to Seattle, William and Catherine were waiting for me. They knew I'd been somewhere. They didn't ask where. I went straight to my room and locked the door. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep, my mind cycling through everything Melissa had told me, everything I had learned about my own existence. The next morning, I confronted my parents again. I asked them about the biological donor, the genetic father. They said his identity was protected by the agency, that they didn't know his name. They said the contract they signed gave them no information about him, and him no information about me. He had donated sperm and signed away all rights and all contact, just like Melissa had signed away her rights to carry me. "So he doesn't even know I exist?" I asked. "He was told that his donation might result in children," William said, "but he had no way of knowing specifically about you." I felt something twist inside me. There was a man out there whose genetic material had created me, and he had no idea I existed. Meanwhile, I had half-siblings who wanted to meet me, and a woman who had carried me in her body for 9 months and then had to let me go. My existence felt like it had been built on a foundation of fragmentation and deliberate separation. Over the next few weeks, I tried to maintain a relationship with my parents while also processing the fact that they had fundamentally lied to me. It was like trying to hold two completely incompatible truths at the same time. They loved me. I believed that. But they had also erased a crucial part of my story to protect themselves and their own narrative about what family meant. I went to therapy. My therapist, Dr. Chen, no relation to Melissa as far as I knew, helped me work through the anger and confusion. She told me that betrayal by the people closest to us is one of the hardest things to process because it undermines our ability to trust our own understanding of reality. "They taught you to believe one story about yourself," Dr. Chen said, "and now you're being asked to accept a completely different story. That's disorienting and painful." "How do I forgive them?" I asked. "You don't have to," she said, "but you might choose to eventually if they show genuine change and remorse. Right now, you're allowed to just be angry." I allowed myself to be angry. I was furious at William and Catherine. I was angry at the agency that had created the separation between Melissa and me. I was angry at the biological donor for being an anonymous absence in my life. I was angry at everyone and no one, at the system, and at the individuals who had participated in creating this fragmented version of me. 2 months after finding out the truth, I made a decision. I was going to reach out to my biological father. Melissa had told me that the agency sometimes released information if people specifically requested it, especially if the donor had also taken a DNA test. She suggested I look into it. I did research online and found that some agencies had changed their policies. I sent an email to the agency that had handled my surrogacy, explaining my situation and asking if they could provide any information about the donor. They responded a week later saying that the donor had not authorized the release of his information and they could not provide his identity. But they gave me an option. I could create a message that they would forward to the donor, and if he wanted to respond, he could. I spent 3 days writing that message. I rewrote it at least 20 times. I wanted to explain who I was, where I came from, why I was reaching out. But I also didn't want to seem like I was asking for something I had no right to ask for. In the end, I kept it simple. "Hi, my name is Alina. I'm 23 years old and you're my biological father. I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know that I exist and that I'm okay. If you want to talk, I'd like to hear your story." I sent the message through the agency, and then I waited. Days went by, then a week, then 2 weeks. I started to accept that he wasn't going to respond. Maybe he had moved on from that part of his life. Maybe he didn't want the complication. Maybe he had built a version of reality where donating sperm didn't mean creating a person, and my message threatened that version. Then, 3 weeks later, I got an email from the agency. He had responded. His name was Marcus, and he was a professor of literature at a university in California. He said he was shocked to hear from me, but that he wanted to meet me if I was willing. He said he had often wondered what happened to his donation, and now he had an answer. He was nervous but also hopeful. He gave me his phone number. I called him that night. He answered on the second ring, and for a moment, I could hear him breathing on the other end like he was as nervous as I was. "Elena," he said. "Hi," I said. "I'm really here." We talked for 2 hours. Marcus told me about his life, his family, his career. He told me that he had donated sperm in medical school, just like Melissa had been a surrogate in medical school. They had both needed money, and they had both been trying to help people. He said he had never known whether his donation had resulted in children, and he was amazed to find out that I existed. "I want to meet you," he said. "Would you be willing to come to California?" I went to California the following weekend. I flew alone. My heart pounding as the plane descended into Southern California. Marcus was waiting at the airport, holding a sign with my name on it, even though we had both looked each other up on social media, so we would recognize each other's faces. When I saw him in person, I was struck by how much of his face I saw in my own reflection. We had the same nose, the same chin, the same eyes. Seeing him was like seeing my future self in reverse, like looking at where I came from written in someone else's face. "Hi," he said, and he smiled, and I saw my own smile reflected back at me. We drove to his house, a small cottage near the university where he taught. He introduced me to his wife, Linda, and his 2 adult children, neither of whom were surprised to meet me, because Marcus had already told them I existed. They welcomed me into their home like I had always been there. That evening, sitting in Marcus's living room, I felt something shift inside me. I had come into this world as the biological child of 2 strangers who had been separated by legal agreements and agency policies. But now those strangers were becoming less strange. They were becoming real people with their own stories, their own lives, their own reasons for doing what they had done. Over the next month, I maintained relationships with both Melissa and Marcus. I talked to them regularly. I met Melissa's children, Sophie and Oliver, who were warm and curious about me. I spent another weekend with Marcus and his family in California, and I slowly began to understand that my identity wasn't fragmented. It was just bigger than I thought it was. I had 4 parents now, in a sense, 2 who had raised me and 2 who had created me biologically. Each of them had played a role in making me who I was. But I still had to figure out my relationship with William and Catherine. Because they were still my parents, the people who had raised me, who had put food on my table and helped me with homework and supported me through my childhood. But they had also lied to me for 23 years, and that lie felt like it might be unforgivable. I talked to my therapist about it extensively. They made a choice, I told her. They chose to lie to me instead of trusting me with the truth. "That's true," Dr. Chen said, "and they made that choice because they were afraid. Fear doesn't excuse the lie, but it explains it." I wasn't sure if understanding the explanation was the same as forgiveness. One day, about 3 months after finding out the truth, William called me and asked if I could come home for a weekend. He said Catherine had something she wanted to say to me. I drove down to Seattle, not knowing what to expect. When I got there, my parents were waiting for me in the living room. They looked older than they had a few months ago, like the weight of the truth had aged them. Catherine had prepared something. She had written me a letter. She asked if I would let her read it to me. I sat down, bracing myself for more justifications, more explanations, more attempts to make their lie seem reasonable. But that's not what the letter was. It was an apology, a real one. She talked about how they had been selfish. She talked about how they had prioritized their own narrative over my truth. She talked about how they had denied Melissa her role in my story and denied me the right to know where I came from. "We were afraid," Catherine wrote. "We were afraid that if you knew you were carried by another woman, you wouldn't think of me as your real mother. We were afraid that if you knew who your biological father was, you'd want to leave us and go find him. We let our fear make us selfish, and we hurt you in the process. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. And I want you to know that you can have relationships with Melissa and Marcus, and I won't feel threatened by that. Because they're a part of your story, and your story is important to me. Hearing Catherine say those words didn't immediately fix everything, but it opened a door. It showed me that they were willing to acknowledge what they had done wrong. It showed me that they weren't just making excuses. They were actually trying to understand the impact of their choices on me. I told them about Melissa and Marcus. I told them about the conversations I'd had with them, the time I'd spent with their families. William listened quietly, and then he said something that surprised me. Melissa was brave, he said. What she did for us carrying you was brave. We should have respected her more than we did. We should have told her that. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. William and Catherine reached out to Melissa, not as a threat to their relationship with me, but as an acknowledgement of what she had done. They sent her a card thanking her for carrying me. They asked if she would be willing to meet with them. And one afternoon, I sat with all 4 of my parents in a restaurant, and we had a conversation about me. Not a comfortable conversation, exactly, but an honest one. Melissa talked about her experience of carrying me. Marcus talked about why he had decided to be a sperm donor. William and Catherine talked about what they had been thinking and feeling when they decided to do surrogacy and when they decided to hide the truth. And I listened to all of them, piecing together the story of how I came into the world. By the end of that year, I had built a new version of my identity. I was still the daughter of William and Catherine, the people who had raised me and loved me and supported me. But I was also the biological child of Melissa and Marcus. I was the half-sister of Sophie and Oliver. I had 4 parents instead of 2, and my family was bigger and more complicated than I had ever imagined it could be. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when I felt angry at William and Catherine for lying to me. There were still times when I felt the strange distance of being genetically connected to Melissa and Marcus, but not having grown up with them. But there was also something beautiful about it. I had been given the gift of knowing where I came from, not just genetically, but also as a person. I understood the sacrifices that had been made for me to exist. I understood that I was the result of 4 people's choices, and each of those choices, whether right or wrong, had led to me being here. I graduated from college a year later with a degree in biology. I had decided to study biology because I wanted to understand genetics in a deeper way, to understand the science behind what had created me. When I walked across the stage to get my diploma, all of my parents were there, sitting together in the audience. William and Catherine on one side, Melissa and Marcus on the other. They applauded together, united in their pride in me, and I felt the full weight of my own existence. I was the sum of all their choices, the good ones and the bad ones. After graduation, I moved back to Portland to be closer to Melissa. I got a job at a hospital, working in the genetic counseling department. It felt right, somehow, to work in a field that helped people understand their own genetics and their own origins. I was helping other people navigate the same territory I had had to navigate. 6 months into my job, I met someone. His name was James, and he worked in the cardiology department. He was kind and curious, and when I told him my story, he didn't run away. He understood that my family was complicated, and he seemed to appreciate that rather than be threatened by it. We started dating, and a few months later, he asked me to marry him. He proposed with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and I said yes immediately. When I told my family about the engagement, all 4 of my parents responded with joy. William and Catherine offered to help with the wedding. Melissa and Marcus sent congratulations. James, meeting all of them for the first time at a family dinner, seemed overwhelmed but happy. This was what it meant to be part of a complicated family. This was what it meant to be loved by 4 people who had come together because of me. Planning the wedding, I had to make a decision about who would walk me down the aisle. Traditionally, it would have been William since he was my father, the man who had raised me. But I wanted to honor all of my parents. So I asked William and Marcus to walk me down the aisle together. It was unconventional, but so was my family. On my wedding day, standing between William and Marcus, I felt the full weight and joy of my complicated life. I was marrying James, but I was also celebrating the 4 people who had made me who I was. I was celebrating Melissa's sacrifice and her courage. I was celebrating Marcus's willingness to know me, to be part of my story. I was celebrating William and Catherine's love and their eventual willingness to tell me the truth and accept the complications that came with it. When the ceremony was over and I was pronounced married, all 4 of my parents stood up and cheered. They were celebrating together, united not by genetics or marriage or law, but by their connection to me. I looked out at them, and I realized that this was what love actually meant. It wasn't simple. It wasn't uncomplicated, but it was real. A year after my wedding, Melissa, Marcus, William, and Catherine did something I never thought would happen. They all came to my house for a dinner party. James and I cooked together, and we served everyone a meal. It was awkward at first. There were silences. But as the evening went on, something changed. They started talking to each other. Melissa asked Marcus about his teaching. Marcus asked William about his financial advice. Catherine complimented Melissa on a story she told about Sophie. William laughed at a joke Marcus made. By the end of the evening, they weren't just a collection of 4 people connected to me. They were becoming something else. Not quite friends, maybe, but people who shared an understanding of what it meant to be part of a complicated family. 2 years after I took that DNA test, after I learned that my entire identity had been built on a lie, I understood something important. The truth wasn't going to destroy me. The lie was what had tried to do that. But once I had the truth, I could rebuild. I could take all the pieces of myself. The person William and Catherine had raised me to be, the biological legacy of Melissa and Marcus, the trauma of discovering the truth, the healing that came after, and I could integrate them into a whole person. I was Alina. I was the daughter of William and Catherine. I was the biological child of Melissa and Marcus. I was all of those things at once, and none of those things negated any of the others. I was complicated and whole. I was fragmented and complete. I was everything I was supposed to be. Standing in my kitchen one morning, looking at a family photo we had all taken together, I thought about that day in the lawyer's office when my world had changed. I thought about the anger and confusion and betrayal that had followed. I thought about Melissa's face when I met her, about Marcus's email, about William and Catherine's tears when they finally told me the truth. I thought about how much I had learned about myself in those 2 years. I had learned that love wasn't simple. I had learned that family could be messy and complicated and still be real. I had learned that the truth, even when it hurt, was always better than a lie. I picked up my phone and called all 4 of my parents. I told them I loved them. I told them thank you. I told them that I was grateful for all of them, even though my gratitude came in different forms for each of them. And I meant every word.